Hey everyone, welcome back to another week. I'm going to be continuing the discussion of Rabbinic Judaism and its influence on Judaism throughout time. But I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking necessarily about the Talmud and about the Jewish literature that arose during this time. Because last week we spent a lot of time, we talked about the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash and the Tosefta and some of these other really important literature texts. But I wanted to address something specifically for this class because I received a fair number of questions actually on the email that is basically asking, well, what does this mean for Jews nowadays? How do Jews use the Talmud? It's this expansive text with, multiple volumes depending on the edition. Um, and so how did Jews use that in their daily life? Well, Jews still do study the Talmud directly in the yeshiva. The Orthodox men will get together at the yeshiva and they'll read directly from the Talmud and continue that interpretative model that had been set up previously. But the Talmud is used in another way, and that's through the creation of halakha or Jewish law. The Talmud is the basis for the Jewish legal system, um, and but essentially, the halakha as we see it, as it develops throughout time, comes from the Talmud, but it's kind of a distillation of the information from the Talmud because the code is so vast and so wide. Jews want to know, well, how do we take from this massive, you know, compendium, this multi-volume text? What do we take from that? How do we find our rules for living daily life? And so, as the Talmud is analyzed throughout time, we get the creation of this concept of Jewish law, which, when I talk about the rabbinic effect on Judaism until the modern day, this is one of the most primary elements of that is the creation and maintenance of this Jewish legal system. Now, one point that I've made throughout the semester is that Judaism is a legal system. It's not just a religion. It actually is a code of laws that dictates how Jews are supposed to sort of comport themselves throughout life, not just spiritually, but also with the day-to-day. Um, if we read in the Torah or the first five books of the Old Testament, we see a lot of instructions in terms of daily life, daily living. What happens if, your cattle comes onto my land and eats my grain or something like that. Um, Jews who represent sort of a cohesive unit we talked about in the very first week, an ethnicity, a religion, and a nationality must necessarily have a code of laws, a law by which they can operate. It must necessarily contain a penal system to prosecute crimes and um, laws to regulate contracts and things like that. And so all of these things come up in Judaism. We've talked about the development of the law as beginning with the Torah, which is the written law, and the Talmud, which comes to represent kind of the writing down of the oral law. Now, I've made the point in previous classes that the Talmud kind of represents the crux of the Jewish law. And that is true. But if you ever read in the Talmud, it doesn't really say thou shalt not this, thou shalt not that, as we're used to in the Torah or the Ten Commandments, that type of law. What it is it's a number of rabbis discussing issues and then coming out with sort of consensus arguments. But what they're doing is they're showing that there are legitimate disputations, legitimate opinions that different rabbis have, and it ends up being the opinions upon which most of the rabbis agree, or the opinion of the most learned rabbis, the most influential ones. And as you read and become familiar with the Talmud, you become familiar with who those rabbis are. And then they speak sort of authoritatively. But my point is that the Talmud is more of a discussion. It's a discussion on thousands of issues. But you don't read through the Talmud to become sort of clear on what the law is. It takes kind of learned person and experience, a rabbinic experience to be able to pull the law out of the Talmud. So let me just talk a little bit about what the the Talmud anticipates that rabbis will do in interpreting Jewish law. In the very one of the very first tractates of the Talmud, one of the most important tractates, Pirkei Avot, uh, translated as Ethics of the Fathers. This this mandate is given to rabbis or to those that read the Talmud to build a fence around the Torah. That's one of the most fundamental principles of Jewish law. That sounds kind of different, but let me explain what that is. Essentially, what that means is that wherever you have the Torah, there will be um, opportunities to commit sin that sort of surround the law. Now, basically, what that means is that you should build a fence in terms of creating additional requirements that just make sure that you don't violate the law. So if it's a little bit unclear what the law is or what might violate it, you should be extra careful in establishing your code and establishing your laws to just make sure that you do not violate anything from the Torah. Now, it's still a little unclear. I know. Let me read this scripture here. This is from Deuteronomy 14:21 of the Hebrew Bible. It says, "Ye shall not eat of anything that dieth of itself. Thou mayest give it unto the stranger that is within thy gates, that he may eat it, or thou mayest sell it unto a foreigner. For thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. Thou shalt not seethe a kid in its mother's milk." Now that last part is what we're going to talk about. Seethe is basically to boil or sort of to cook by boiling. So it's saying that you shall not cook a baby goat in its own mother's milk. That sounds a little bit macabre, a little bit strange, but basically what the Jews have taken out of this, just this one phrase, is the whole concept of their kosher laws of not eating milk with meat. So rabbinic discussions have ensued about what this means. And the conclusion has been that it means that we should not eat milk and meat together. So you can see that what they're doing is they're building a law around the Torah. This is an actual thou shalt not. So it's important for the community to understand what they should not do, what this means, because this is in the Torah. This is in the written law. And so what the conclusion that they come up with is that we shouldn't eat milk and meat together. And those of you that are familiar with kosher law um, know that Jews that follow the practice will have two separate refrigerators. They'll have two separate microwaves. They won't keep milk and meat in the same microwave or the same refrigerator. They won't eat it at the same time. They'll have to let a certain number of hours go by before they eat milk after they've had meat. If you go to a McDonald's that's kosher, for example, in Israel, you can't get a cheeseburger. They don't have cheese at the same restaurant. Most kosher restaurants don't serve milk and cheese at the same restaurant. So all of that comes out of this one phrase and an attempt to understand what that means and to apply it. And you can see how what they're doing is building a fence. They're making more prohibitions just to make sure that they live this law right here. And that pops up again and again as Jews progress throughout time. Another example is as they come across different plants in different lands, certain plants are not kosher, and that's in the Bible. Now, if they come across another plant that is sort of similar, like a kind of like an example is legumes or beans. If they come across a bean-like plant in another place that isn't necessarily the same thing that's prohibited in the scriptures or in the Torah, then they may make that prohibited as well, just to be sure, because they don't really know why they're not supposed to eat certain elements, and so they'll kind of extend the fence around this other thing, this other food, just to make sure that they don't violate that as well. So it's a fascinating practice. You can see how violation of the law is extremely sort of frowned upon. This isn't a doctrine that's similar to, say, a Christian doctrine of grace or something like that. This is very kind of letter of the law. This is very everything that we do is to ensure that we do not violate the law. Um, so after the Talmud, I talked earlier about how the Talmud is difficult to understand what the law is. It's hard to pull the law out of because it's kind of everywhere. It's all these different discussions, these different rabbis with different opinions. So what has happened throughout time is that certain learned sages of Judaism have taken the Talmud, they've taken all of the authorities of Jewish law, and they've basically pulled out the law or codified the law. They've kind of shrunk it down to the exact thou shalt nots. These are the laws. We can read them and understand them. It's not confusing with discussion. This is what comes out of the Talmud. Um, we've talked in previous classes about Maimonides. He's one of the most influential sages. He did a codification in the 13th century called the Mishneh Torah, and that was important. But the one that has come across as being the most important throughout time is called the Shulchan Aruch. It was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo in Safed, which was in the Ottoman Empire. So we were talking this week about the Ottoman Empire and about um, the freedom that the Jews had in the millet system, and kind of the greater freedoms that they had under Ottoman rule. And this, it's not surprising then that this was written in the Ottoman Empire, and it's to demonstrate how Jews are supposed to live the law, kind of the Sephardic law, the Sephardic Jews, or the traditions that they had established. Um, Shortly thereafter, Moses Isserles, who was an Ashkenazi Jew, he did the mappa, which is basically tablecloth. That's the translation of tablecloth, which is supposed to be the tablecloth for the set table of the Shulchan Aruch. So if the Shulchan Aruch is the table, the mappa is the tablecloth, and basically what it is just glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, or sort of interpretations of the Shulchan Aruch. He goes through and he makes certain changes based on Ashkenazi law. So that's the Ashkenazic consideration. So when the Shulchan Aruch is published nowadays, it almost always has Moses Isserles's mappa, or his glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, to show that, yeah, basically the Shulchan Aruch is right, but this is the difference between the Sephardic law and the Ashkenazic law. And so these are the main codes that are used in Jewish law. Now these even have been distilled even more throughout time. We'll talk about that here for a second. Um, as Jews move out into the diaspora, as they kind of travel to different areas and live in different areas, and we've seen, Jews have basically dispersed all across Europe, all across the Mediterranean, all across the Middle East. They come across unique situations that aren't necessarily found in their codes of law. And so what they've done throughout time is they'll send letters to their rabbis, kind of the legal experts. Sometimes that's in their city, sometimes it's not. Sometimes they have to send them to, a capital where there's going to be a learned legal scholar. And these are termed responsa literature. Responsum is the singular, and that's basically a response from the rabbi. So you'll send in a question about a situation that you're running into. You're not finding the answer in the code that you have, the code of law, and your local leader can't find the answer for you. And so a learned Jew will send back the response, and they'll address these new types of situations. Because you can imagine, as as Jews progress throughout time, they're going to run into new scenarios that weren't necessarily anticipated or spoken of in the Talmud or in these codes of law. And so this responsa literature, as a body of literature, all these responses together, ends up becoming kind of a new addition to the law, which addresses the law in more modern times. Another interesting point of Jewish law is the concept of minhag. Now, again, Jews are everywhere, and they all have different traditions. Traditions that they practice that maybe aren't even sort of biblical or even within legal the law, but those traditions become so important to them that they are actually sort of codified as commandment, and that's called a minhag. Minhag is a tradition of your fathers that you are actually expected to live and anticipated that you will live. This is interesting because Jews in say a neighboring city or a neighboring country who don't have the same minhag do not have the same expectation of living that. It's basically an idea that you are true to the faith of your fathers, essentially, and you follow their traditions, their minhagim. An interesting example of this: festivals in the diaspora. Now, I mentioned this word a couple times. I can't remember if we've touched on it in previous lectures, but the diaspora is basically everything outside of Israel. It's the spread of Jews in Babylon, in Syria, in everywhere, Europe. It's kind of one grand term that referred to as the diaspora. Now, there's an interesting practice. This is very ancient as well. That Jewish festivals, Jewish holidays were celebrated for 2 days in the diaspora instead of one. Um, Now, the reason for this is basically because before Judaism had a calendar, they determined the length of their months based on when the new moon would arise. And this was something that the Sanhedrin would publish. The Sanhedrin is the highest court in Jewish law that existed at the time. There's no Sanhedrin now, but this was during the temple periods. So the Sanhedrin would see when the new moon would come up, and then they would light this massive bonfire. Now, just like you've seen in movies and depictions and things like that of these systems of communication, this is exactly what they had. The bonfire would light, and then someone at a post, miles away would light their bonfire, and bonfires would be lit all the way up to Babylon. And Jews in the diaspora would see that the new month had begun. Now this is important because lunar calendar kind of fluctuates, and they there was no way of knowing whether the month would have 29 days or 30 days. It depended on when the new moon would arise, and so they would have to know when to start the calendar, when to calculate the days based. So if they had a month coming up, um, the month of Av, for example, and they needed to know when the ninth day of Av was, which is a holiday, Tisha B'Av, they would need to know when the month started and then count 9 days and then start the holiday. So um, they would wait for that bonfire to know when the month started, so they could be worshiping the holiday or kind of worshiping on the holiday on the correct day, the same day that they're doing it in Jerusalem. So what would happen is that there were certain groups within the Jewish community in Jerusalem who were kind of opposed to the Sanhedrin, or kind of opposed to sort of the control, and so they would light fires and they would kind of throw off this system. They would light fires on the wrong day and things like that, and ultimately the system of signal by fire became difficult, and sort of not very reliable. And so the Sanhedrin would send forth riders to all these outposts instead, and that would take quite a bit longer. And so there was no way to really tell them on the exact days, when the new month would start, as there was before. And so this tradition arose in the diaspora, where just to make sure that we're celebrating on the correct day, we're going to celebrate for 2 days. One day in case the month is 29 days, and one day in case the month is 30 days. And then they'll know exactly, then they'll make sure that they've covered the days. So that is an example of a minhag that arose. But here's the interesting point, is that once the Jewish calendar was set, once the lunar calendar was set and it was distributed, and these places in the diaspora had the actual calendar, and they knew when the days would fall and they would calculate it, and it wasn't based on sort of the lunar interpretations of the Sanhedrin, they didn't really need the 2 day celebration anymore, because then they could be sure that they were celebrating on the exact day. But they continued it even up until today. It's still a tradition in the diaspora to celebrate most holidays over a period of 2 days rather than one. Um, and that's just an example of maintaining that tradition. It's a tradition of their fathers. It's a good thing. I mean, who doesn't like to celebrate for 2 days? And so they've continued that throughout time. Um, Finally, there's the concept of the poskim. The poskim represent certain Jewish scholars, even up until now, that are basically authorities in Jewish law. Um, and they are their responsibility is to respond to new and address new situations. Just a brief example. The Talmud speaks in terms of when life ends, cessation of life, and there's a little bit of a dispute. Is it when the chest stops rising, when the chest stops, breathing? Is it when the heart stops? Is it when putrefaction ensues and the body starts to smell? There's all these disputes. And so, in the Middle Ages, they can come to a consensus. They can decide on what they believe that is. Now, what happens when new medical evidence gets introduced? Now we have the concept of brain dead. Well, what happens in Jewish law if a Jew is brain dead but being kept alive by machines? Is that person considered dead or not? So these are the types of issues that necessitate a modern authority, and that's the poskim. A number of rabbis, very learned, kind of recognized throughout the Jewish world as being learned and scholarly, and they will sort of write and interpret um, Jewish law based on new situations, and that actually becomes what I talked about earlier, kind of more distillation of the codes. They'll take the codes and they'll even distill them even more, and at times they'll add different things to them to address new situations. So that's kind of an idea of sort of an overview of Jewish law throughout time. Um, so we can see how the rabbinic tradition, by introducing this concept of Jewish law, um, has been able to sustain Judaism throughout time because this is one of the key structures of the rabbinic tradition and of the Jewish legal and religious tradition up until the modern day. So I know that there were a lot of new terms introduced in this lecture. Hopefully they're clear. If you have any questions, please contact me. But again, this lecture was meant to build on last week's, which introduced the rise of the rabbis and the rise of the Jewish literature and show how that Jewish literature has been used throughout time. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of me. Thank you.